Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces here, and also people who I don't know, but I saw on the list that we have some from Scituate, Kingston, Marshfield, and then all the way from West Roxbury. So thank you for being here. We're very pleased with the turnout. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Noel Ashekian. I live in Norwell, and I have a son in elementary school. And I've organized this forum along with a few other parents from Norwell and also with Common Core Forum. Common Core Forum is a nonpartisan volunteer organization that was started by Donna Calorio. Donna is actually here tonight at the handout table. Donna started the organization a little over a year ago, and she is an educator at the college level, and she is also a former school committee member from Worcester. And the mission of the Common Core Forum is to help spread the word to parents and educators about Common Core and Park, and it's a statewide endeavor. We believe that what is happening right now in public education in our country is monumental. In fact, we think you'd be hard-pressed to find anything as significant in the history of public education unless you looked all the way back to the passage of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's how significant this is. So it's great that you're all here tonight, and I thank you. I know that many of you have unanswered questions and concerns, like who wrote the Common Core standards? Who approved them? What does the new nationalized test look like? Who is developing the test? Who's really running the show here? It's our hope tonight that your questions will be answered and that some guidance will be provided so that you can decide what your next steps should be to ensure that we preserve a high quality education for all of our children. We have two guest speakers tonight, Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Institute, and Dr. Sandra Stotsky, a Professor of Education Reform from University of Arkansas. We also want to mention that we did extend an invitation to Mitchell Chester's office. For those of you who don't know, Chester is the Massachusetts Commissioner for Elementary and Secondary Education. We also extended an invitation to the State Board of Education members, and all declined. At the end of our speaker presentations, there will be time for Q&A, so we ask that you hold your questions until then. And we provided paper and pens and pencils so that you can write down your questions, and if you'd like, you can even indicate on the paper if you want them directed to a particular speaker. After the Q&A, we're going to announce the winner of our raffle for our Dunkin' Donuts card, and then we'll have some closing remarks. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jamie Gass. Jamie Gass is Pioneer Institute's Director of the Center for School Reform. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state and municipal levels. He has appeared on numerous Greater Boston media outlets as well as talk radio across the country. Jamie speaks on school choice, academic standards, and school district accountability at events throughout the country.
So thanks so much. I want to thank Noel and Julie and Donna and Michael and all of you for coming out tonight. Before I begin, I want to just tell you, so my name is Jamie Gass. I'm Director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. Pioneer is an independent, nonpartisan think tank from Boston. We've been around for about 20 some odd years. 90% of the funding that Pioneer receives is from private donors. We don't accept any money from government, which allows us and has always allowed us to be completely independent and author research that is data-driven and peer-reviewed that really calls it like we see it. But let me just tell you a little bit about Common Core to start off. So Common Core is a set of English and math standards, national English and math standards, that were developed by the National Governors Association, which is the Washington, D.C. based trade organization that represents not states, but the governors of each of the states. And then the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the commissioners of education from each of the states. Again, they don't represent states, they represent the commissioners in their membership. And a vast majority of the funding for Common Core, the development of Common Core, the advocacy for it, has come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've spent about $200 million in the last 5 or 6 years advancing Common Core. That's a private philanthropic organization. They're not accountable really to anyone or the public. And the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers are also not publicly accountable organizations. So I'm going to begin by sort of prefacing my remarks from James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution and authored the Bill of Rights. He wrote this in 1792. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion, it would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America. Now again, this is a guy who knew a thing or two about self-government, about constitutionalism, about rights. And I think drawn from the Founding Fathers, there's a great deal of wisdom that has been embodied in this country, which is the national government does particular things. It does trade and defense and foreign policy and commerce. But all of the institutions that most directly impact the lives of citizens, particularly K-12 education, are really controlled by the state and local governments. And state and local governments historically and legally and financially in this country is the proper legal jurisdiction of the states and localities. They call this federalism. It's a balance between two types of government, the state governments and local governments and the national government. In the 1830s, there's a well-known French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to come and visit this country and find out what this new country and this new kind of government was all about. He wrote a very famous 2-volume book called Democracy in America. And as he wrote these books and as he toured around the country, he was really stunned how unique and different it was, certainly from his native France, but most of the European countries, where all of the decisions related to subjects' lives, really, in those countries, were determined by kings and queens and czars and ministers and people at court. And he said, this is not true in the United States. It's really quite different. The Founding Fathers understood that local institutions and civic organizations, this is where self-government resides. These are where the places where the ideas for government come from. And of course, it's not a shock. And the founders really wanted to perpetuate our democracy through public education and informed citizens. And public schools are intended to be a wellspring of our democracy and our republic, and are supposed to embody the civic virtues that they felt were necessary to perpetuate our way of life. And I would argue that this system of federalism, this balance between state and local governments and the national government, has actually served this country quite well. In the last several hundred years, we've gone from essentially a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world. This is no small accomplishment. No other country in that same period of time can make that kind of claim. And yet, sometime after World War II, it began to be clear that while we had been among the leaders in the world in terms of the performance of our kids by all kinds of international measures, it became clear during the late 1950s in the space race, specifically around Sputnik, that we were losing our edge. And that was really kicking off a big effort to particularly improve the quality of math and science instruction. But by 1983, there was a report that was issued by the U.S. Department of Education under President Reagan called The Nation at Risk. And what this report talked about was that the decline in public education was real and profound. We had dropped from among the top performing countries in the world to between 11th or 17th in the world, and particularly the drop had been most dramatic in the area of math and science. But what the Nation at Risk report did not do was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems, because everybody across the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, have always understood what I said at the beginning, which is that K-12 education is the authority of the states. And so there's been a lot of different remedies and proposals on how to fix K-12 education. Some people, as the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers and some of the teachers unions and some of the people that the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan, Bill Bennett, called the blob, the DC-based blob, these trade organizations that sort of gobble up lots of bureaucratic power over our schools. They've always believed that we need to have national standards, testing, and curriculum. The fact is that there's really no tradition of that in this country. We don't have a national system of education, even at this late date. We don't have a national system of education. We have a collection of state systems. We've got 50 state systems. There's been other people that think the way to remedy K-12 education is to give more parental choice through private schools and parochial schools and charter schools and vocational technical schools and all kinds of desegregation of urban schools, that parental choice will create competition, and that competition will force the pre-existing public schools to improve. Well, what Massachusetts did in 1993 was really quite different from what most of the other states tried gradually throughout the 1990s, or 1980s. And Massachusetts, too, had declined. I mean, the reason why we began to initiate education reform in the early 1990s was that Massachusetts as a state had always been, historically, going back to the founding era through the 1830s and right up until through the 20th century, had always been regarded as a higher performing state. But by 1993, we really had fallen to kind of middle of the pack on the SAT. We were no longer seen as a kind of prestige state. I remember 20 some odd years ago when I got involved with K-12 education, New Hampshire was the state that everyone really was aspiring to be because they were the highest performer. And so what Republican Governor Bill Weld did was sat down with Tom Birmingham, who was a pretty liberal Democrat. He had a great relationship with organized labor. He was a labor lawyer. And Mark Roosevelt, who was also a pretty liberal Democrat, who was a rep from Beacon Hill. And they crafted this landmark Education Reform Act. And I don't mention their party affiliation by way of being partisan anyway. I'm just trying to illustrate that it was a bipartisan effort, that both Republicans and Democrats of goodwill sat down and figured out we need to do something dramatically different. And what they came up with made for not only good politics, but good policy. What they did was they traded a great deal of additional financial resources at both the state level and a minimum threshold at the local level. And we've spent about a little over $100 billion in the last 20 years in exchange for all of the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous decades. Specifically, we were going to have a high-stakes test for graduation, and all of you know that as the MCAS test, which has been important because it really has injected a lot of quality and measurement into the system. But a test is just a test, and it has to be based on really high-quality standards. You're fortunate because Dr. Stotsky, who was one of the architects, really the prime architect of the Massachusetts standards in English and math and science and history, is here tonight. So you're going to hear a lot from her about the specifics. But what they really did was they ignored all of the fads and the fuzzy math and the self-esteem approaches, all the things that kind of gotten the country and the state into a mess by 1993. They said they're not going to do that anymore. We're going to ground our academic standards in the basics of English and math and science and history. So English teachers are going to teach classic literature, poetry, and drama. And the reason why that matters is that the quality of the vocabulary found in classic literature, poetry, and drama is just better. The sentence structure, the plot, the character development, all of the uses of language are superior. But in addition to that, there is an enduring humanistic value of literature and poetry and drama. I mentioned at the beginning that the whole purpose of K-12 education is to develop citizenship and to develop citizens that are capable of judgment, and compassion and sympathy for their fellow men and women. And this is accomplished through stories. I mean, when you read stories like Huckleberry Finn and you learn about the relationship between Jim, a runaway slave, and Huck, essentially an orphan white kid, you're learning about friendship. When you read Charles Dickens, you're learning about compassion and sympathy. When you're reading about Sherlock Holmes, you're reading about reason and judgment and discernment in decision making. And all of these things matter profoundly because education isn't just about workforce development or more applied things. It's about developing human beings, the kind of human beings that you want to have in your community, the kind of human beings that you want to have voting and making decisions about self-government. And these things matter. In the area of mathematics, they used all of the evidence from the high-performing countries like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and elsewhere, and said we're going to have access to Algebra 1, which is the gateway for all higher-level mathematics. We're going to have that in 8th grade, because in order to have kids get to a path where they could be in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, they called it STEM fields, you have to start with algebra early, so that you have the requisite building blocks to get to pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry. And that's exactly what Dr. Stotsky and others did, and other states did this too. California is another example that did this. And so the Ed Reform Act, it was the money in exchange for the high standards, academic standards, the testing, teacher testing, so the students are going to be tested on the same kind of academic material that the teachers are. It's a kind of a golden triangle of the testing for teachers, students with high quality standards. And the fact is that while the rest of the country has been stuck in various degrees of stagnation and decline for the last 20 some odd years, Massachusetts and what we did in the early 90s really is a tribute to the taxpayers who paid for it and the lawmakers who crafted it and the policymakers who developed the standards and the teachers and the principals and the superintendents and the people that did the work. Because the results are stunning. They have far exceeded the expectations of even the architects of the Ed Reform Law. So in 2005, there's a test called the Nation's Report Card, the NAEP test, National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been around for about 30 or 40 years. No state's ever been #1 on that test, in every grade tested, in every category tested. And Massachusetts in 2005 was the first one to run the table and be #1 in every grade tested, in every category tested. And then they did it again in 2007, in 2009, in 2011, and 2013. I tell audiences that this is the equivalent of winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 straight games every single time. It's a remarkable, historic, hard-won accomplishment. But as the Nation at Risk report talked about in 1983, in order to compete in the 21st century and compete with the Hong Kongs and the Singapores and the Japans and the Germanys and the China and the Indias, you've got to compete in the area of mathematics. And so in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test. This is the gold standard of international math and science test. And our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. And in the area of mathematics, in both 4th and 8th grade, we were in the top 4 or 5 countries in the world. This is the equivalent of winning an Olympic gold medal. And then we did it again in 2013. Every single measure, whether it's the domestic measure, SAT, ACT, or international measures like the TIMSS testing or another one called PISA, everyone knows that Massachusetts is the place to be in terms of academic achievement. It is a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. That's the good news. The bad news is that in 2009, there was a federal grant program called A Race to the Top. Now here in Massachusetts, we knew that when you're talking about the race to the top, it's really the race to become Massachusetts. And so what the Obama administration did is they took the developed the standards that were being developed by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the Governors Association, the Common Core standards, and they baked that into the criteria for the federal grant program. So this $4.3 billion in federal money that the states had to compete for, they had to agree to sign on to a bunch of policy objectives that were in the Race to the Top. And Common Core and the adoption of national testing were in Race to the Top. So in the summer of 2010, when most of you were at the beach and relaxing and having a good time and barbecuing, that's when Massachusetts and the Board of Education adopted the Common Core. It was late July in 2010. Well, prior to the adoption, Pioneer Institute, where I work, we're researchers. First and foremost, we're researchers. And so what we did is we enlisted Dr. Stotsky and a guy named Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He's an internationally renowned mathematician who worked on the very high quality math standards in California. Zev Werman, who's a Silicon Valley engineer who had also worked on the standards in California. We got these researchers together and these experts and scholars together to look at every draft of the Common Core, and there were 4 of them that they rolled out in several months, to look at and crosswalk back and forth between high standard states like Massachusetts and California and Indiana and Texas and Minnesota against Common Core in both English and mathematics. We wanted to judge the academic quality because, of course, Massachusetts had the most to lose. And what these researchers found in painstaking detail in these 40, 50-page papers was that in both English and in mathematics, that Common Core at every step of the way was of significant lower academic quality than what high standard states had already. So it wasn't going to be a race to the top. It was really going to be more like a race to the middle. And the advocates of Common Core had to have Massachusetts. They had to have California and Indiana and these high standard states adopt, because if Massachusetts adopted and they were number 1 and we were internationally competitive in math and science, all the other states would fall into line. I mean, what could Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana say if Massachusetts had signed on? Which is precisely what happened. Specifically, though, in the evaluation of the standards, the advocates of Common Core, and Sandy will talk about it in a lot more detail, these folks had no real prior experience writing K-12 standards before. Most of them had never taught in K-12 education. Most of them were not known for their work in standards development at all. They ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and all the high standards, high-performing states and countries. They cut the classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%, so that is gone. They replaced it with a philosophy of what they call informational text, which has some good things in it. It's got things like the Gettysburg Address, which we all agree is something that kids ought to know. The problem is that the Gettysburg Address really belongs in a history class. It doesn't belong in an English class. I think that's a fairly obvious thing, that teachers of English should be teaching English, not history. But specifically, the advocates of Common Core have talked about what they call cold reading. So you're supposed to forget that the Gettysburg Address takes place in the middle of the Civil War. You're supposed to forget that it's consecrating a cemetery. All of the background knowledge and historical context, which is going to give that text meaning to children, you're supposed to forget that, right? That's the cold reading approach. And then they have all kinds of other exciting texts for kids to read through informational text, things like EPA manuals and write federal regulations from the Federal Reserve Bank. I mean, this is really riveting stuff. I mean, I think if we have problems and concerns about dropout now, can you imagine what a semester of reading about EPA manuals and Federal Reserve regs are going to do for kids' attention spans? And then the area of mathematics. They also ignored the evidence from all the high standards countries and high standards states and moved forward access to Algebra 1, not in 8th grade the way it had been in Massachusetts and California that had led to these historic accomplishments, but really in the beginning of sophomore year, so 10th grade. So the kids in this country who have adopted Common Core will be a grade or more behind their international competitors. And this matters enormously in the science, technology, engineering fields. They also use an experimental form of mathematics under Common Core, that is, or of geometry, that has never been successful in any place it's ever been tried. It really tops out at what Professor Milgram calls Algebra 2 light. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, Common Core is a path to nowhere, right? Even the advocates of Common Core and the authors of it really say that when they call Common Core college and career ready, what they really mean is community college and career ready. Now, the next piece of research that we looked at, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there are some legal issues. There are these issues of federalism. Whose jurisdiction are state standards and state testing? So We enlisted the former General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel in the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, the two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government. And what these two lawyers mapped out for us in research, in excruciating and dry lawyerly detail, is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating, encouraging, bullying, advising states to adopt national standards testing and curriculum. Specifically, those laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, which was signed by Richard Nixon, and then the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, which was signed into law by Jimmy Carter in 1979. Again, not by way of being partisan, but I just think it's important to note that 2 of the 3 laws were signed by pretty liberal Democrats. So when the advocates of Common Core say, well, the opposition to Common Core is very extreme, not really. Those 2 Democratic presidents that signed it were hardly what you would call Tea Party presidents. But it's not just our researchers' opinion. There's a column that I put over there by George Will, one of the best respected syndicated columnists of the last 30 years or so. And he's done 2 of these columns in the last couple of years. One of them citing our research, the other one drawn heavily from our research, saying specifically that the U.S. Department of Education is brushing aside federal laws. They're pretending that the laws that prohibit them from national standards testing and curriculum doesn't exist. He talks also about how when the U.S. Department of Education directly funded the PARCC testing, Massachusetts is in a national testing consortium called PARCC, which will replace the MCAS. That was funded by the federal government, which is illegal. The next area of research we looked at is the cost, because even though the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has pumped $200 million into it, and you've got all these big DC-based lobby groups like the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers advocating for it, and you've got 40-some-odd states that have adopted now, very few, if any, states have actually did a cost analysis. So the Board of Education, the Department of Education, the governor, the legislature, the state budget office, none of them actually just said, what's this going to cost? So we thought that someone should take a look at that. We enlisted a researcher who had worked for both Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill and had experience at the state level in testing, and he and his team came up with a figure of about $16 billion to implement the Common Core. The biggest cost driver will be the multi-year technology costs. So all of the testing will be done online as opposed to paper and pencil tests. That is enormously expensive. You may be seeing this in your districts already, where they are buying an enormous number of iPads and laptops to have kids do the testing. But it's all new textbooks, so if your community in 2010 bought new textbooks, those have to be thrown away because Common Core will require all new textbooks that will be aligned to the standards. All new teacher training, so even though we have spent over $100 billion to be #1 in the country and internationally competitive, our projections are that it's going to cost the Commonwealth an additional $350 million to align with Common Core. Again, it's important to emphasize that this is not funding that will come from the federal government. This will be borne by the state and local government, and I would say a vast majority of that will be by the local governments. And you may already begin to see this on the municipal side or in your school department budgets where they're putting all kinds of technology bonding bills into local government. There are a lot of issues around data collection, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it other than I'm the father of 2 daughters. One of my daughters is 3, the other one is 7. And some of the things that run parallel to Common Core in terms of collecting student-level data through what they call longitudinal data systems that were all adopted through this race to the top. It's not just that it's close to Halloween, this stuff is creepy, and it's unnecessary. It's really sort of educational make-work. Massachusetts became #1 in the country and internationally competitive, not by collecting 400 pieces of personal identifiable data on every child so that some bureaucrat can pick where they're going to go to school, but the 10 pieces of important MCAS data that tell teachers and principals where kids aren't doing well, what subjects, what grade levels, and they can make adjustments. So a lot of the data collection is both troubling from an ethical standpoint and a legal standpoint, because the U.S. Department of Education has also brushed aside parental privacy laws that prohibit the federal government from collecting these data on our kids. But it's also just unnecessary. It's more bureaucratic red tape that, frankly, our schools have too much of to begin with. The good news of all this is that from the beginning, Texas, being Texas, and their mantra being "don't mess with Texas," said, we're not doing this. They're not doing Race to the Top, they're not doing Common Core, and they use this as an opportunity to get Dr. Stotsky and Professor Milgram and others to elevate their standards to a point where they're now higher, or as high as what Massachusetts had before. So Texas is a huge state, it's a huge textbook state, so there will be textbooks and there will be materials that are not aligned with Common Core. But we're also seeing now, as state legislators, who again were almost totally cut out of this process. In most state legislatures, there were no bills, there were no hearings, there were no bills and hearings in Congress. So as congressmen and state legislators and people at the grassroots level are finding out about it, frankly, they're not so damn pleased about it, because they're getting stuck with the bill, and no one even bothered to tell them. And again, they're the ones who allocate the funding, right? Most of the funding comes from the state legislatures. And so Oklahoma, Indiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, Missouri, states that frankly had a lot less to lose than we did, are beginning to either repeal it, they're doing reviews. Not all of it is going perfectly, but they are beginning this process of trying to pull the tentacles off of this octopus that has been wrapped around their schools and their state. I guess finally, I would say, as I did at the beginning, that the whole purpose of K-12 education in this country is to serve as a wellspring for citizenship and develop future citizens to perpetuate the ideals of our country. As a citizen and as a parent, it is deeply, deeply troubling that when the adults that are running the system, the Commissioner of Education, the members of the state boards of education, the governors, many of the superintendents, they won't debate it. In a lot of places, the experience that Noel has had here, where you invite the Commissioner of Education and they won't show up and they won't debate it, they won't engage this topic publicly, that is a big, big problem. There are deep problems with the standards, there's deep problems with the legality, there's problems with the cost and all the data mining. But on a basic democratic level, when the people that are making policy are brushing aside laws and trampling on the rights and duty, really, of citizens to voice their opinions and displeasure about something and won't engage in a public debate, then I think that it's time that we put a stop to it. So I've given you a lot of information. I'm really grateful for your time and your interest, and I appreciate the folks who've set this up this evening. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jamie. Dr. Sandra Stotsky is a professor of education reform at the University of Arkansas and the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality. Her latest book is The Death and Resurrection of a Coherent Literature Curriculum, published by Rowman and Littlefield in June of 2012. She served on Common Core's Validation Committee and on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel. She was Senior Associate Commissioner in the Mass Department of Education from 1999 to 2003 and served on the Mass Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010. Please welcome Dr. Sandra Stotsky.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to visit you here in Marshfield. I would also like to mention that I grew up in Bridgewater. That's my hometown, so I am very familiar with this area. In fact, I am familiar with what Marshfield was years ago when we used to go on some very back roads to get to Fieldston. That was about it many years ago, but it's certainly grown up a lot, as has Bridgewater itself. I'm going to talk in my 35 minutes or so about 4 major audiences that were left out, just to give you a sort of overview of the picture from my point of view, being on Common Core's Validation Committee. why I think they were left out, and then I'll talk about the flaws in ELA standards and some of the flaws in mathematics standards, which are on papers that were here. Some of you may have already picked them up, but it may be useful for you to have them to look at briefly or to take them, and I'll mention them about where you can also give them. And I'll talk a little bit about the PARCC tests in particular and suggest some ways out for people to think about for further civic participation and political action, parent options as well, because I talk about all of these things as I go around the country, talking in about 30 states now, even more. I just came back from Illinois and Missouri last week with some very interesting meetings with different groups and different individuals who are engaged in the process of supposedly revising their Common Core-based standards because of a bill that Governor Nixon in Missouri signed, but like many other governors recently who have either set up revising committees or have issued orders or created bills for supposedly looking at alternatives to Common Core, it is very clear that parents are being deceived quite deliberately, and that these committees are designed to return what I called a warmed over set of Common Core standards to them, as happened in Indiana several months ago, another state I was involved with at the time. Let me begin with a little bit more of my background immediately so you'll understand one of the issues that I had to confront almost immediately on Common Core's Validation Committee. I grew up, as I told you, in Bridgewater, an open town meeting, and I had a history teacher who was the moderator of town meetings, so I grew up knowing a lot about town government. I've lived for many years in Brookline, which is a representative town meeting, and I have been a representative town meeting member for 10 years, and I was also a library trustee for 14 years. So I have taken part in town government in different ways. I've also been on many selectmen committees and school committees, search committees in particular. I've been a very active citizen, and my children all went to the Brookline Public Schools all the way through. So I know the public school system very well. What struck me from the very beginning when I was asked to be and placed on Common Core's Validation Committee at the end of the summer of 2009 were the people who were not on the committees that should have been on the committees. As I pointed out, 4 major audiences were left out. So far as I could see, parents were nowhere to be seen. Teachers were almost nowhere to be seen. I have taught in my life, both at the elementary and the high school level, many years ago. And it was striking to me that there were no high school math teachers or high school English teachers on standards development work groups in the spring of 2009 when they were developing the college readiness standards. None of the standards writers in either ELA or math were high school English or math teachers, had any experience teaching in K-12 for the most part. One had some experience in math at the middle school level. And on the validation committee, which was the 3rd major committee set up by the Common Core project, again, there were no high school math, high school science, or high school English teachers, no literary scholars. There was one mathematician, James Milgram, whom you'll hear me mention more than once. He and I used to talk a lot together. I was the only English language arts standards expert by virtue of what I had done here in Massachusetts and elsewhere. He was the only mathematician, someone with a PhD in mathematics who knows the content of mathematics. And I just had a rousing discussion last week in Missouri with some mathematics educators at the University of Missouri who want to understand why I seem to think that mathematicians know more about the content of mathematics than they do. This was a major concern to them, that they thought I was in some way belittling them. I wasn't. I was simply pointing out that when you have a doctorate or an appointment in a school of education, that is quite different from having a PhD in mathematics and teaching mathematics in a department of mathematics in a university. Makes all the difference in the world in terms of content standards. We're not talking about pedagogy, we're talking about content. So we've had two groups that were left out, parents and teachers, and then state legislators were nowhere to be seen, which was why I, in the past 2 years, have been traveling around to many states talking to hearings, to legislators at hearings or in other settings, explaining what Common Core is, because they didn't know what it was 3 to 4 years after it had been adopted by their own state board of education. This was something that was surprising to me. And then local school officials, school committee or school board people, were the other group, totally left out. And if you think about it, those are the 4 groups closest to education in this country. They were not there to be seen. So who was on these committees? For the Standards Development Committee, it was mainly test developers, something that should have aroused the attention of the media, but didn't. They didn't ask. How come? Most of them are connected to test development firms. The standards writers themselves, 3 in English, 3 in math, were totally unknown to the field. Nobody knew who they were, why they were chosen. We still don't to this day, because one of the aspects of this whole process that struck me was the total lack of transparency. Couldn't get any information on anything to do with why people were chosen, what their contracts were, what their charge was, anything that would be open, legitimate information for any local form of government or state form of government. And then for the validation committee, we had a number of people who are prominent in education research, but not in the 2 subject areas which were the focus of the charge of this committee. What does a validation committee mean? What is it supposed to do? Our charge was to ensure that the standards being developed were internationally benchmarked, rigorous, and research-based. And Professor Milgram and I were 2 of the 5 people on this less than 30 committee who would not sign off because we didn't see that the standards met these criteria. And we've been talking about it for 5 years. We have still yet to find out why they were not internationally benchmarked, research-based, why certain decisions were made about their content that were made. We still don't know. This is 5 years later down the pike, as schools are now implementing these standards the best they can with great difficulty in most states, and we're now expecting next year the first major tests based on these standards. Flaws in English language arts. Do we have that paper available for you to just take a quick look at? I'm only going to go through this very quickly because I have written about this so many times, and on my website I have an enormous amount in detail about all of this. Here are the missing standards at the beginning. The overall deficits, let me say a little bit more about. Stress on writing, not reading. That struck me only after I began to look more closely at the document, because it didn't strike me at first. It's not something you would notice at first. You'd have to see what was happening in the classroom. And the reason I became aware of the problem with that is because my own graduate background is in reading research. That was what I focused on at the Harvard Graduate School of Education under someone named Jean Chall, who is well known in the field of reading research and beginning reading instruction. And as we know from 100 years of research, all students need to read more, they need to read better. all good writers have been good readers. Good reading precedes good writing. And Common Core has got it backwards. That's not the only thing it got backwards, but that was a major thrust of its ELA standards that are backwards as far as I'm concerned. It also stressed something different that had not been ever stressed in English classes. Reading informational text. I'm talking now secondary level primarily. Informational text was something rather new that was brought in. It was maybe a middle of the night inspiration to David Coleman, the chief architect of the ELA standards. And what it means is a reduction in literary study in K to 12 if you follow the number of standards that are there. What teachers do on their own, what schools do on their own is a different story. And that is why there may not be quite as much damage as one might see from looking at those standards. There are 19 standards in reading at every grade level for reading instruction. 10 of them are for informational text, 9 of them are for literary. That's where I get my 50-50 from. And they are at every single grade level from K to 12 in English. Most of the English language arts standards document, it's about 65 pages long. Most of that document is about English. But the last 8 or so pages, unbeknownst to history, science, math teachers, they were surprised. They hadn't expected that a document for English language arts teachers was going to have something for them in it that would also reach out and in some way affect their own subjects. And these are called literacy standards, and you will see something at the bottom of the page to point out what 2 historians have agreed after we worked on a report together, that the exemplars in a famous Appendix B in this document that is suggested for informational reading in high school classes in order to improve the amount of, or increase the amount of informational reading that our students do, because David Coleman, again, chose to believe that somehow this would make these students who don't read much informational text, if they read more, this would make them more college ready. No evidence for it, but evidence didn't matter in any event. But the second point is important because, as the historians have pointed out, the literacy strategies that are recommended in an English class or in a history class are not appropriate for the study of history. You do not approach a literary work with skills like contextualization, sourcing, and corroboration, but you do that with a primary source document in history, but those skills aren't there. So study of history may be damaged by Common Core, depending again on the teacher's judgment and whether you've got an older experienced teacher who knows better. Once they're gone and new teachers come in from our education schools, we will have a different situation to consider, think about. So that's just a very quick overview of some of the issues in English language arts. Mathematics poses a different set of problems, and I urge all of you, no matter what grade your own child may be in, to take a look at what Professor Milgram has come out with. I have a 1-pager or a 2-pager. Both are available. He actually has 13 pages on his website, which is more than what most people want to look at, including high school math and science chairs. But they are the ones you want to give copies of this to. Give it to your superintendent and your school board or school committee if you wish, but they are as likely to not understand them as I cannot either. I am not in mathematics, but he vets anything I say or write about mathematics. And this is what he prepared in a long version and in this short version, so that one can understand what the problems with Common Core's math standards are. Delayed in the first 7 grades so that by middle school he estimates that our students will be about 2 grades worth behind their peers in high-achieving countries. Then he looks at what's missing in Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, and if you look at the long list, the 2 pages, you'll see even more. It was the path to calculus that he's talking about, because the path to calculus is extremely important for STEM careers. One of the reasons for national standards, we were all told years ago, was that we needed to expand the STEM pipeline, science, technology, engineering, and math. You see it all the time. And what is happening if schools do not go beyond and do something about the deficiencies in Common Core's math standards is that we will be shrinking the STEM pipeline. That means that students coming from a total Common Core math curriculum in high school, K through 10 or 11, it ends with about a weak Algebra 2, as he estimates it, will not be able to take 4-year STEM majors in computer science, mathematics, science, engineering, economics, finance. There may be more, because more and more majors have become more STEM-oriented, beginning with more advanced math and science coursework. As you all know, science piggybacks on math, so if the math isn't there, then the science will not be there either. So this is why I suggest that you simply give it to your school committee and high school chairs and ask them what they're doing to ensure that these missing components are there in some way for those students who might be able to take advantage of these kinds of courses with these topics in them. English you can do the same with, also with. It is a critical deficiency in Common Core, and we hear almost nothing about it. Not clear why, and it isn't as if the 2 mathematics PhDs who are on the standards writing committee didn't understand the problems in what was in the standards they were creating. I was on the State Board of Education in 2010, and in March 2010, Commissioner Chester invited Jason Zimba, one of the chief math standards writers, to come to a Board of Education meeting in Malden, and I was the only one on the Board of Education who asked him to explain what college readiness meant. That's all. It was an open question. He indicated it meant minimal readiness for a non-selective college. He understood exactly what he was creating. Whether he chose to do it or whether there was pressure behind him, we still don't know, because it's very possible that others behind a curtain that we could never penetrate were calling the shots. But he certainly understood, given his own PhD in mathematical physics from Berkeley, what was missing in high school. And he has said that students who want to go on for engineering are going to have to take more than what is available in Common Core. Now, one might say, where is higher ed in all of this? Well, mysteriously, for the most part, they've been out to lunch. They have no idea and may only now be beginning to be told to start thinking about the coursework they're going to be offering in freshman and sophomore years, those students who are labeled college ready. Let me get to what was to be the prize in these college readiness standards, and I will explain something that may not be obvious at first to most of you. All state standards up to now have been standards aiming for a high school diploma. That's what all high school standards were for. They would serve as the basis for exit tests or other tests, end of course tests, that would lead to whatever requirements were in place for a high school diploma. Common Core is the first time in this country's history, and probably elsewhere so far as I know, where a set of standards at high school are called college and career readiness standards, assuming that those two are identical at that point in what they require for either college or career, but that if you pass a grade 11 test, as the PARCC test will be given next year in grade 11, and are declared college ready, you are thereby entitled to a credit-bearing courses in your freshman, sophomore year at college, if you choose to go and if you are accepted. It can't control everything, but it does eliminate most of the remediation that is now taking place at the college level. This was a big sales pitch to a lot of legislators when they heard about it, or maybe boards of ed. Oh, we're getting rid of remediation at the college level. You're getting rid of it by defining what is college ready down and giving credit at the college level for what is a high school level course. Because as Professor Milgram has said, if you have a weak Algebra 2 course as your top math course in high school, and you have a college readiness test that tops out at Algebra 2, weak Algebra 2, the pass score is going to be 1 or 2 grades probably below. It'll be somewhere between grade 8 and grade 9. If students who pass the test are then declared college ready by definition, because they've passed a test called a college readiness test, and go to college, what will be the nature of the mathematics course they may take if they must be given credit for it? Now, mathematicians can play chess as well as anybody. It may be an intermediate algebra course. It may be a college algebra, which means remedial algebra 2. It all depends what strengths the student shows. But it's certainly not going to be calculus, and it won't be trigonometry, which is still below the level of coursework needed for the STEM, 4-year STEM majors. So there are a lot of adjustments to be taking place in the future, and higher ed is going to be asked to look at them by their chancellors or presidents, who are asked to sign on to Race to the Top applications back in 2010, and who probably had no idea what any of this meant, because they typically don't ask their teaching faculty what any of this is going to mean for them. And in addition, if they were public colleges or universities, they want to make sure the legislature continues the flow of appropriations to their college or university. So if they're asked to sign on to something that they are told will remove remediation at the college level, they don't ask, how will remediation be removed, and what will that mean for those students who don't know the material they need for going on in certain areas. So we have a lot of eye-opening that will take place in the next few years if the PARCC tests and Smarter Balance, the other major test consortium, are given as planned. Now, what are some possibilities? Ways out. I said I would just mention that briefly. One major possibility, depending on outcome of elections, especially here in Massachusetts, is a delay of Common Core-based tests, whether it's PARCC or Smarter Balance. In this state, it would be delay of the PARCC test. Simply delay giving the test and set up authentic committees to review or revise the existing standards. One of the issues that has come to my attention in every state I go to, and at meetings where there are teachers who are willing to talk, is how few teachers are willing to say anything, and if they do, it's almost never anything positive about the Common Core standards that they are implementing with the supposed curriculum of their choice in their classrooms. I was in Morton, Illinois, near Peoria last week, and a union coordinator who came to the meeting that we had hoped would have more teachers than it did, he said, do not expect most teachers to show up at a meeting that's public because they do not want to be seen at any meeting where they may be exposed to critical comments about Common Core. He said they're afraid of, because they may have on their personnel record something that is a negative label. I'm blocking on the word that should be used. I'm sorry, it will come to me. The word that's going to indicate that they simply are negatively oriented teachers, not discredited. I'm sorry, there's a special word that's going to be used for teachers. Jamie, have I told?
Insubordination? Or?
Insubordinate. They will be declared insubordinate. It is a word that has many definitions depending on the state, and insubordination will be the charge against teachers, they have been told, who talk negatively in teacher rooms, faculty rooms, to each other, to parents, out in the street, are seen at forums where they're learning something about Common Core that is not seen as positive. So insubordination could be used to evaluate them negatively and then fire them. And why is that a real threat to them? Because one of the goals of Race to the Top money was the evaluation of teachers. That was one of the major purposes. This is what Secretary of Education Arne Duncan indicated he wanted from each state in return for Race to the Top money. They had to set up a teacher evaluation framework. And we have one in our state, and in many states there is a certain percentage based on the scores from the tests that the students take that are Common Core based tests that will be used, factored in to their evaluations. So they have to be careful not only about teaching to the test adequately so the kids' scores are high enough, but they have to be careful not to be labeled insubordinate when they try to get more information about something they may be concerned about. So delaying or defunding the testing based on Common Core standards is one. Removing teachers from an evaluation framework that is tied to those scores is second. They should not be held solely accountable for kids' scores on a Common Core based test. This was certainly not true of MCAS. It held schools and districts accountable, but not individual teachers. There can be a move by local school committees to ask for a return to the old standards that we had pre-2009. And you have to be able to specify a date because, as you may or may not know, the tests that have been developed after 2010, after the board adopted Common Core, those standards have been gradually fed into MCAS. Right now, we are facing a very peculiar situation. I don't know quite how to understand it myself, but we have a grade 10 MCAS test to be given to over 50% of our kids, based largely on Common Core's standards, that will be compared with the results of a grade 11 PARC test, also based on Common Core's test items. I am sure some of the test items will be identical, but one's at grade 11, the other's at grade 10, because that was where they were set by the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act to allow for 2 years of remediation for students who might have failed the test in grade 10. There are other differences. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time just going through some of these little differences that you should be aware of. The items that are used for the overall score on the old MCAS had to be released every year. That was in the statute. I know of nothing similar for PARC. Now, the release of those items was very important to both teachers and parents. They could see what their kids were failing or doing well on. But if you don't see the items, and remember most of the tests are going to be computer-based, so it's not going to be easy to see them anyway. MCAS used booklets. I don't know if it will even be given in computer form, but you had a release of those items. You also had test items for MCAS that were developed by Massachusetts teachers. They vetted them, they reviewed them. The tests that are going to be used for Park are being developed elsewhere unless they take the items.
That's when someone comes in and out.
Oh, okay.
Back to work.
Just wondering if there was something
Yeah, no,
I should
no.
be responding to somewhere. But the items that are being used on the grade 10 MCAS and the grade 11 Park, maybe they will be used eventually nationally, because this may be a form of pilot testing them. We don't know. Nobody's come clean on this. I don't know anyone who's discussed it yet. I've asked a reporter about this for the Boston Globe, and he agrees with me, because we remember Jeff Nelhouse, who's the assessment director for Park, saying this in 2010, that they were gradually going to introduce Common Core standards into the curriculum, and therefore the test items by law must be based on what the kids study in the curriculum. So in one case, a test is going to be given at grade 10. In another case, it's going to be given in grade 11. And part of what the board voted on back in 2010 was the idea that Massachusetts should not give up MCAS unless it could be sure that Park was just as good or strong, something like that. Now, I'm not sure how you equate the two, because kids in grade 11 know more than kids in grade 10. I don't know how you equate two different tests. Even if the items are the same, kids should be doing better on the same item in the next year. Some of you who know a little bit about test construction can understand that. None of this has been explained. We don't know what's going to happen, but you should be aware of the fact that the items might be the same, but there is a difference, as you know, between grade 10, grade 11, and kids should be expected to know more in grade 11 because they're a year older. There's another difference. The prize is higher. Grade 10 under MCAS, if you passed it, gave you a high school diploma. It led to your fulfilling high school competency requirements. If you pass the grade 11 Park test, your prize is credit-bearing courses at the college level. That's a much higher prize. So you should expect more from kids for a higher prize. I don't know how this is all going to be handled. There are more questions that I'm sorry I can answer, and maybe I shouldn't be tossing it out to you, but you need to think about it, because I don't even know how superintendents or school people are trying to explain it. Let me get down to local options for local school committees. According to what the Council for the Association of Local School Committees in Massachusetts, every state has an association of its local school boards. The council for the one in Massachusetts, in response to a member of the Peabody School Committee, replied that so far as he could tell from looking back in state statutes, going back, as you know, hundreds of years in Massachusetts, that most of the basic authority, legal authority over school policy still remained with the local school committee. In other words, it hasn't been taken away by your state legislature. I only know of one, maybe Louisiana, where the state legislature 2 years ago literally took away the legal authority of the local school boards in that state. So if you have a school committee with legal authority that it has always had for hundreds of years, it can refuse, number one, to adopt Common Core. It can adopt any other set of standards it wishes. It could go back to the pre-2009 if it wants, but it's free to choose any other. And it can direct its superintendent to make sure that the teachers in the school system put in a curriculum that addresses those standards. That's all within the authority today of local school boards. The glitch comes with the mandate that state boards have by statute to require local school boards or committees to administer a statewide test based on the standards the state board has adopted. We knew when I was in the Department of Ed 12 years ago that no local school committee had to adopt the good standards we had, and there were about 60 or 70 communities in the state that hadn't adopted them because they weren't required under local control to adopt them. If the communities did poorly on the state test, then there would be a compliance unit that would come and say, well, we can see you're not using the right standards, you better start using the right standards, or there are going to be some serious consequences. But given that local school boards or local school committees can choose their own standards, choose or approve the curriculum that they want their teachers and others to develop, and make sure that it's taught, because remember, they direct, they hire and fire the superintendent and teachers, and that's where accountability rests with those who do the hiring and the firing. They still must administer a test that is mandated by the State Board of Education. However, it is not clear in anyone's mind, because it hasn't happened yet, whether the local school committee can say, since your Common Core based test that you are requiring us to administer contradicts the curriculum and the standards we have legally adopted in town X, maybe we have to go to the state Supreme Court to argue it out. We don't know. There are different kinds of court cases now taking place across this country. That is not one I know of yet, but it's one that I can imagine, because you've got to think about a clash between a statute that a state board has governing it and the authorities that local school boards have had for hundreds of years in this country, whether they were colonies or whether they were territories before they became states. Where does that leave parent opt-out? And this is what I will finally end with, because this has been a burning question all over the country. So far as I am concerned, and a lawyer, Jane Robbins, who has been working with South Carolina and Georgia on some of these issues there and elsewhere, and others who've looked into the legal aspects of it, parents don't need permission to opt their kids out of any state test. Parents have always been able to homeschool their children if they want. That's available in any state. Some states have requirements or qualifications, but all parents have the right to homeschool. Always have had that right. They have the right to keep their kid home if the kid's sick. They have the right to take the kid away on a vacation if they want to go away on a vacation. These things have happened. They can keep their child home, or, as more and more are deciding to do, they can send their child to school with a note that says their child is refusing to take the test and they want an alternative instructional session provided for their child. And indeed, something we saw yesterday from the school committee person in Worcester. He had something, a letter that had come from Commissioner Chester to, I think it was the Worcester School Committee.
Oh, it's right here.
Oh, do you have it? In any event, he is indicating that there should be a provision for instructional alternatives. If parents send their children to school with a note saying, we don't want our child to take the statewide Common Core test, you have to make sure that they can still take teacher-made tests, because they always have taken teacher-made tests. But instructional alternatives that are appropriate can be made by your local school committee, and your local school committee is the group that decides on any penalties that should be there, if at all. This is another issue that's come up. Can kids be put in a closet? Can they be docked with their GPA, on their grade point average, or declared truant or something like that? That is not an administrator's decision. That has to be a local school committee's discussion with open meeting to discuss it. It is within their authority to make such penalties, but they have to be discussed and voted on. And then, of course, you have the right to vote them out if you want to, vote them in if you want to, whatever. But the point is, your school committee is the locus of legal and statutory authority, and they tell their administrators. This is going to be a surprise to a lot of school committees, because unfortunately, and this is true all over the country, school committees have seen themselves more as rubber stamps for what their local administrators tell them they want. It's true on library boards too. It's not only just school committees, I know that. But I was never a rubber stamp on any committee I've been in, so that's why I have learned that you've got to get the shoe back on the foot where it belonged to begin with, because that was the nature of citizen boards. Citizen boards are supposed to be in charge. It's basic political principle. Professionals propose, citizen boards dispose. It's an old saying. But I'm going to stop here because I'm sure you may have many questions to ask of both of us, and some of them may not be answerable right now, but I think at least you ought to have a chance to get your questions out. Thank you.